August 30th, 1935. The Florida Keys bask under a flawless summer sky. Sunlight dances across the water as Henry Flagler's overseas railway echoes faintly in the distance, threading together small island towns and scattered federal work camps. Families prepare for the Labor Day weekend, making plans for rest and relaxation. World War I veterans, far removed from the gunfire and trenches of Europe, toil under the tropical sun, building a highway that will finally connect the Keys to the mainland. Meanwhile, far to the east and beyond the horizon, the sea is quietly plodding. Over the warm, shallow waters of the Bahamas, a small, unimpressive storm begins to awaken. By nightfall on September 2nd, this nameless swirl of clouds will strike not as a simple hurricane, but as the single most intense storm ever to make landfall on the continental United States. In the summer of '35, meteorology is still in its infancy. The science is dominated by meteorologists using pencils, paper charts, and educated guesses. There are no satellites, no radar screens glowing with swirling storms, just a few scattered observation posts, telegraphed reports from ship captains, and island weather stations. On August 31st, a tropical depression takes shape in the southeastern Bahamas, somewhere about 60 miles east of Long Island. The U.S. Weather Bureau sends out its first advisory. The tone is measured, even reassuring that there is a small but noteworthy tropical system. Yet, in less than 24 hours, the storm reaches Andros Island, and it has jumped from a weak Category 1 to a ferocious Category 5. Despite its fury, the hurricane is small, dangerously small. The kind of hurricane whose compact eye wall concentrates every mile per hour of wind into a tight, lethal core. The Weather Bureau tracks the storm as it scrapes through the Bahamas and emerges into the Florida Straits, carving northwest like a spinning buzzsaw feeding on the Gulf Stream's heat. Sunday, September 1st brings the first flicker of real alarm as forecasters on the mainland begin to realize Florida may be at risk from a direct strike. The Weather Bureau orders storm warnings for the Florida coast from Fort Pierce to Fort Myers. At 9:30 a.m., the U.S. Coast Guard station in Miami sends a plane skimming low over the coastline, tossing message blocks into campgrounds and marinas. These messages are simple. Big storm coming. Seek shelter now. A second flight follows that afternoon, but by Monday morning, the planes are grounded and the hangar doors shut tight. By 3:30 a.m. on Labor Day, Monday, September 2nd, 1935, a new advisory warns that the storm will probably pass through the Florida Straits with high tides and gales for the Keys. But as the day progresses, meteorologists begin to realize the Keys will take a direct hit. What makes this storm particularly dangerous is its stealth nature. When the hurricane crosses over the Bahamas, it lacks a distinct eye, one of the key visual cues for detection in the pre-satellite era. Meteorologists cannot clearly track the storm's position. Instead, they rely on persistence forecasting, assuming the storm will continue moving at the same speed and in the same direction. This technique predicts that today will be like tomorrow, but the Labor Day hurricane is about to prove that assumption fatally wrong. The Cuban Weather Service sees no evidence of the approaching storm by early September 2nd, and no one is sure where it is. Then, a Pan Am flying boat pilot, on his daily Key West to Havana run, notices a cloud mass to his east but much further north than where the hurricane should be. He alerts the Cuban National Observatory upon landing. The observatory requests the Cuban Army Air Corps send up a plane to confirm this sighting. Captain Leonard Povey, the Corps' chief training pilot and an American barnstormer, volunteers. Flying his open cockpit Curtiss Hawk II aircraft, he soon finds the hurricane, which he later describes as an inverted funnel of cloud, much further north than expected, and moving northwestward. Since his aircraft is open cockpit, Povey does not attempt to penetrate the clouds, but he circles the hurricane to determine its motion. This becomes the first time an aircraft is used specifically to locate a hurricane, proving the value of direct real-time observation. The Cuban National Observatory relays Povey's critical information to Jacksonville. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the words in the advisories become sharper and hurricane warnings are issued for the Key West district north to Key Largo. By 4:30 p.m., they issue a special bulletin raising hurricane warnings for the Florida Keys. That afternoon, around 2 p.m., a message reaches Fred Gent, the assistant administrator for the Florida Emergency Relief Administration. In the veterans' camps on the Upper Keys, flimsy shacks sit just feet above sea level. If the hurricane hits directly, they will be death traps. Ghent picks up the phone and orders a special evacuation train to be dispatched immediately. The black locomotive pounds south over the single track, whistle echoing in the storm-thick air, trying to beat the clock. But time is running out. The rescue train faces multiple delays. First, an open drawbridge forces a stop. Then, debris blocks the rails. Sheets of rain slash visibility to almost nothing. South of Homestead, the train has to reverse so the engine can face the return trip. Each delay costs precious minutes as the hurricane closes in. Finally, at 8:20 p.m., the headlamp of the evacuation train cuts through the darkness at Islamorada station on Upper Matacum Key. The veterans, some with nothing but the clothes on their backs, are already gathering on the platform. Meanwhile, somewhere offshore, a wall of wind and water, the most intense hurricane ever to strike the United States, is only minutes away. In the rest of the Upper Keys, the evening begins in deceptive calm. The air hangs heavy, cicadas sing, and the tide laps gently at the docks. In the camps, the veterans rest for the holiday, talking softly in the dim light of kerosene lanterns. In nearby homes, families linger on porches, breathing in the smell of salt and mangrove. As the onslaught reaches the islands, the train carrying the veterans from Islamorada is still thundering north, its crew and passengers hoping to reach the mainland before the storm reaches its peak fury. The wind comes first, a rising moan that becomes a roar, blasting the vulnerable islands at over 185 miles per hour. The island's crude infrastructure and plant life are no match. Palms bend low to the ground, their fronds stripped bare, while roofs and buildings shudder before tearing away. The locomotive's engineer, J.J. Haycraft, notices something in the raging storm. At first, it's just a shadow in the darkness. Then he realizes it's a wall of water 17 to 20 feet high, charging out of the Atlantic Ocean like a moving cliff. Within moments, the storm surge strikes the islands with devastating force, pushing 11 of the train cars off the tracks and into the raging waters of Florida Bay, leaving only the locomotive and tender upright. Outside the train, automobiles and pieces of debris spin in the current. Those clinging to the locomotive's steel bulk hang on through the night as it's the only thing heavy enough to resist the ocean's pull. Miraculously, everyone on board survives the chaos. In the rest of the islands, horrified residents cling to whatever they can, hoping the waters won't take them out to sea. Entire families vanish. In the work camps, destruction is absolute. Wooden barracks disintegrate. Tents dissolve into the wind. Entire structures and human beings disappear into the churning black water. More than 260 veterans, along with wives and children who didn't evacuate, die that night. Survivors cling to palm trunks and floating wreckage, dodging debris hurled like missiles by the wind. Yet, amid the horror, there are miracles. 5-year-old Keys resident Pete Perdue later recalls how his family takes shelter in the local hotel, only to flee when the walls begin shaking apart. They find an old school bus miraculously perched atop a mound of fill. As the water climbs toward the roof, they pull strangers inside, neighbors, children, even a dog with her puppies. Standing on the seats, soaked and terrified, they all pray the Lord's Prayer, certain the end is near. Then, as suddenly as it came, the water reverses, rushing back out to sea. Captain Ivar Olsen survives the storm by seeking refuge in his dry dock boat on Craig Key, a small island between Islamorada and Long Key. While the storm's eye passes overhead, Captain Olsen records something remarkable. A barometric pressure of just 892 millibars, a record that still stands as the lowest pressure ever recorded at sea level on dry land. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane remains a benchmark in meteorological history. Its 892 millibar pressure and estimated 185 miles per hour winds still rank it among the most powerful storms to ever strike the United States mainland. It literally reshapes the islands overnight, carving new channels and stripping the entire Keys bare of life. The storm's compact structure makes it uniquely devastating. Unlike sprawling hurricanes that spread their energy over wide areas, this storm is tightly wound. Its radius of maximum winds, the zone where the hurricane's most violent forces are concentrated, is remarkably tiny. In storms like this, the most extreme winds and greatest storm surge are packed into a narrow corridor. You're either just outside the worst conditions or squarely within their crosshairs. Over shallow platforms like Florida Bay and the Reef Tract, this concentration of energy is utterly devastating. The water has nowhere to go but up and over the islands, rising suddenly and violently. Historical accounts describe a towering wall of water sweeping across the low-lying keys. The keys' near-flat topography means even modest storm surge would be dangerous. The estimated 17 to 20 feet of surge is annihilating. But nature's fury alone doesn't explain the high death toll. Human factors amplify the disaster. Hundreds of World War I veterans are housed in lightly built camps, dependent on government transportation and orders for evacuation. Those orders never come in time. These veterans are part of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration's work program employed to build the overseas highway. They had once been part of the Bonus Army, World War I veterans who had marched on Washington demanding early payment of their service bonuses. Many believe the camps in the Florida Keys are intended to keep these potentially troublesome veterans away from the capital. By the time Leonard Povey's flight discovers the storm's true position and the Weather Bureau issues warnings, it's too late for effective evacuation. The train requested at 2 p.m. doesn't leave Miami until 4:25 p.m. When it finally arrives at Upper Metacom Key, it's swept off the tracks by the storm surge, which also destroys much of the railroad itself. When the storm finally passes, the Upper Keys are forever changed. The landscape resembles the bed of a dried river stripped bare. Mangroves are flattened and the ground scoured clean of every building between Tavernier and Marathon. The small town of Islamorada has simply been wiped from existence. Henry Flagler's overseas railway, hailed as a triumph of engineering, is utterly destroyed. Tracks are torn from their beds and hurled aside. The long spans between islands are ripped away entirely. Where wind doesn't twist the rails, surge swallows them. The Florida East Coast Railway, financially and physically dismantled by the hurricane, will never be rebuilt. From Tavernier to Marathon, human settlements fare no better. Islamorada is entirely obliterated. Entire neighborhoods are swept away by winds nearing 185 miles per hour and a wall of water 15 to 20 feet high. Houses are swept off their foundations and roofs hurled into the darkness. Eyewitnesses speak of structures vanishing as if erased from existence. The land itself seems stripped bare. Trees are snapped, uprooted, or left as splintered poles. Sand and soil are scoured away, revealing the coral beneath. Officially, 408 people die in the Upper Keys. The Red Cross counts 409 within weeks, and later estimates climb towards 600 when those lost at sea are included. The storm's eye, just 8 to 10 miles wide, passes directly over the islands. Dead stingrays and conch shells lie beside human remains on high ground. In some places, bodies are hung in trees 25 feet above the ground. In the suffocating heat, decomposition is so rapid that more than 250 bodies are cremated on pyres at Snake Creek. Telegraph lines lie ruined. The railroad is washed away. The Upper Keys are essentially cut off from the world, and no one beyond can yet fathom the scale of the disaster. Not until September 3rd does word make it to the mainland. Coast Guard cutters and Navy ships churn through debris-choked waters, seeking survivors and ferrying the wounded to safety. Military aircraft drone overhead, photographing the ruin from above. The images show towns scraped to their foundations and bridges snapped like twigs. One of the Keys' most notable residents, Ernest Hemingway, rides out the storm in his Key West residence and personally observes the aftermath in the Upper Keys. Hemingway later writes a scathing essay titled "Who Murdered the Vets?", describing the disgusting conditions of veterans working in the Keys and the bodies tangled in mangled debris or lodged high in defoliated trees. He remarks that the stench and sight rival the battlefields of the Great War, searing the story into the public mind and fueling changes in how veterans are treated and disasters managed. President Roosevelt, stunned by the reports, orders an immediate investigation into why hundreds of World War I veterans sent to the Keys to work on public projects had been left in the path of such a storm. Congressional hearings follow, seeking to assign blame, compensate widows and families, and demand better from the nation's disaster response. When the official findings are released, they point not at human misjudgment but at the heavens, calling the hurricane an act of God, as though the machinery of bureaucracy bore no part in the disaster. For survivors and critics, this is a bitter pill. They know the truth is more complicated. Forecasts had been incomplete. Warnings came late or not at all. There were no adequate plans to evacuate residents to safety. But the public, stirred by Hemingway's words and their own sense of injustice, will not let the story fade. Congressional hearings continue into early 1936, pressing for answers, relief for veterans' families, and an honest reckoning with the failures that compounded nature's wrath. Slowly, reform begins to take shape. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane becomes the spark for a sweeping overhaul of the U.S. Weather Bureau's Hurricane Warning Network. New regional hurricane warning centers are established in San Juan, Puerto Rico, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Jacksonville, Florida, each monitoring its own slice of the Atlantic. Forecast cycles are cut from 12 hours to 6, with hourly updates when landfall looms. Congress approves $128,000, significant for the time, to expand observation networks and improve tropical cyclone reporting. The Jacksonville Center eventually relocates to Miami in 1941, evolving into what we know today as the National Hurricane Center. Among the storm's most remarkable legacies is the birth of hurricane aircraft reconnaissance. Captain Povey's brave flight straight into the hurricane's fury discovers it's far closer to the Keys than anyone realizes. His urgent report triggers special bulletins, the first warnings to reach many in the storm's path. Though it comes too late for most, that single flight plants the seed of today's hurricane hunters. By 1938, much of the surviving railway infrastructure is transformed into what we now know as the Overseas Highway, a continuous road from mainland Florida to Key West. On July 4th of that year, the highway opens, a bittersweet fulfillment of Flagler's dream, its bridges and causeways standing as silent witnesses to the storm that made them possible. Today, in the small town of Islamorada, a stone obelisk stands on the side of U.S. Highway 1 at mile marker 81.5, the Florida Keys Memorial, also known as the Hurricane Monument. Dedicated in 1937, it holds the remains of nearly 190 souls, ashes and bones laid to rest in the crypt at its base. Its bronze plaque reads, "Dedicated to the memory of the civilians and war veterans who lost their lives in the hurricane of September 2, 1935. The official death toll from the Labor Day hurricane stands at over 400 people, but the true number may never be known. In a storm that powerful, in destruction that complete, some losses simply cannot be measured. Entire families disappeared without a trace. Bodies were swept out to sea or buried under tons of debris. The storm lasted only hours, but it exposed the deadly gap between our ability to forecast disasters and our systems for responding to them. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane didn't just take lives, it took the very ability to count them accurately. In the end, some losses exist only in the spaces between the numbers, in the families that were never reunited, in the empty chairs at dinner tables across the Florida Keys. The storm's legacy isn't just the record winds or unprecedented destruction, it's the reminder that when the next hurricane enters warm waters and forecast models show uncertainty, the difference between life and death often comes down to a single decision: who acts first and how fast.